Hello, my name is Jarrett Wall, and this is my presentation on third parties. Intro and birth. There is nothing more iconic to our American system than our two parties, Republican and Democrat. These two parties have been the major parties in power in the United States for more than 150 years. So it may be hard to understand that our system wasn't initially set up to be this way, but instead this was an inadvertent result of the Electoral College system. This system, which grants states in a winner-take-all format, leads to the concept of wasted votes, and leads people to vote for one of the two main political parties. In the early days, there was not defined political parties, but instead loosely aligned factions of people with similar ideas. The first two of these main parties being the Federalists and Anti-Federalists. In his final farewell address, George Washington said the following, warning about the dangers of political parties. The alternate dominion of one faction over the other, sharpened by the spirit of revenge, natural party dissension, which in different ages and countries has perpetrated the most abhorrent abnormalities, is itself a frightful disposition. He claimed the partisanship would lead to inner political conflict and divide the nation, and give rise to cases of tyranny. And he was right. While they did not have these political factions at the time, they were loosely aligned and nowhere near the polarization in today's political climate. This polarization leads to partisan gridlock and very little to be agreed upon. These first two parties would switch and change over time, the Federalists eventually being replaced by the Whig Party. A quick little side note about the Whig Party. I was curious what the Whig Party stood for. Like, I didn't know whether it was an anagram for something. So I Googled the Whig Party, and then I found out that the Whig Party actually got its name from the British Whig Party, which was in British politics at the time. And the name Whig itself comes from the name of Scottish goat herders that would oppose the English Parliament. I just thought that was an interesting fact. Like, our country had just broken off from Britain and tried to claim like its own national identity, but we're still borrowing ideas from the British. It's just kind of funny to me. But over time, political party association began to trump individual ideas and would be a major factor in how people chose their candidates. This was easier than learning about every issue a candidate supported. Instead, they would see what party endorsed this candidate, and this made it easier for voters, but also led to candidates being slaves to the party and the party's ideals. This led to very little variations between the major party platforms, and there will always be two dominant parties in the U.S. based on the Electoral College system that we already talked about. Because of this very little variation between the major party platforms, this led to a rise of third parties, allowing a third party candidate to have space to collect these voters that didn't feel like they were represented in these two parties. The first third party was the anti-Masonic Party that emerged in the 1820s. This party would try to establish itself as an alternative to Andrew Jackson's Democrats and John Quincy Adams' National Republicans. This party would collapse as many of its members joined the Whig Party. Modern third parties. Third parties in the modern day serve the same function that they did 200 years ago. You would think that with the modern mass media and the internet, this would have made third parties more accessible to more people. But in the last 5 elections, no third party candidate has received above 3%. But unlike the third party candidates that would crop up in the past that were mostly one issue parties, modern third parties are consistent, long standing parties with strong ideologies. Of these third parties, two stand out, the Libertarian and the Green Party. The Libertarian Party. The Libertarian Party was first founded in 1971 and later fielded its first candidate for president in the next election. It reached its first major success in 1980 when the Libertarian Party got on the ballot in all 50 states. The Libertarian Party is the third biggest party in the United States. Their core values of a political party are devoted to the principles of libertarianism. It supports the rights of individuals to exercise virtual sole authority over their lives and sets itself against the coercive powers of federal, state, and local governments. They believe strongly in a deregulated free market, but they differ from Republicans on many issues like gay marriage and the criminalization of marijuana crimes. The Libertarian Party saw its most success in the 2016 election, obtaining 3.3% of the vote in that election. While this was the highest ever recorded by the Libertarian Party, it was a major letdown because the two major parties ran candidates that were almost universally hated. And early polling even indicated the Libertarian candidate, Gary Johnson, was polling around 16%. Some of the most famous Libertarian candidates are Ron Paul, Gary Johnson, and Joe Jorgensen. Ron Paul is a very interesting candidate that I'll be touching on later, as I will be on Gary Johnson and Joe Jorgensen. The Green Party. The Green Party was first created in 1970. Ironically, the Green Party and the Libertarian Party were formed around the same time. This could give you an indication of the time. Richard Nixon was the president, and the country was still reeling from the corruption of the Vietnam War. Out of this, the American public was not trusting of our two major political parties and looked for alternatives. The Green Party, like the Libertarian Party, is in favor of libertarianism principles and anti-authoritarianism. But unlike the Libertarian Party, the Green Party instead of conservative ideals embraces progressive ideals. The biggest libertarian win came in the year 2000 when Ralph Nader received 2.7% of the vote, the most ever by a third party. Nader too will be touched on later in this video. Out of this came the spoiler effect. The idea that if Nader would not have received 2.7% of the vote, that the Democratic candidate would have won. This is a popular myth regarding third parties, but there is no evidence for it. This 2.7% of voters are clearly dissatisfied with both parties. If they did not vote for a third-party candidate, they likely would have not voted at all. And that is no one's fault except Al Gore. He ran a campaign that allowed Nader to pick up 2.7% of voters with liberal leanings. If he's unhappy with this, he should have ran a campaign that reached out to these voters more. Teddy Roosevelt, the first real hope for third parties. Teddy Roosevelt was Republican president for 2 terms before stepping down for his successor, Taft. Taft differed from Roosevelt in many ways, not being as radical as Teddy was. So Taft, who was seeking re-election in the following year, found himself campaigning to win the Republican convention against a former sitting president, the first time a sitting president has ever run against a former president. Roosevelt did not get the Republican nomination, and this prompted him to split off from the Republican Party and found his own party, the Bull Moose Party, also known as the Progressive Party. This Progressive Party differed very extremely from the Republican Party. Their platform included restrictions on campaign finance contributions, the establishment of a social insurance system, an 8-hour workday, and women's suffrage. This was truly a party ahead of its time. Roosevelt ran a strong campaign, but his campaign struggled with the all-too-familiar problem of third parties, money. Roosevelt did not have the backing of the two big parties and thus didn't have the same level of funds. On October 14, 1912, Roosevelt was in the state of Wisconsin, about to hold a campaign rally when he was shot by a saloon keeper from New York. The bullet hit him in the chest, but thankfully his 50-page speech slowed the velocity of the bullet. I'm sure Teddy was very thankful for long-winded 20th century speeches. Today's teleprompter speeches would not have stopped any bullets. He later would even deliver this intended speech at this event. Yes, he delivered a speech after he had been shot. I give this anecdote because it shows something about the Bull Moose Party itself. This party was a cult of personality, not a party of ideology. Yes, the Progressive Party had strong beliefs, but it was only held together and viable under Roosevelt, a man who, even when shot, was still able to deliver a 90-minute speech, a man who would form his own political party after feeling snubbed by the Republicans. Without Roosevelt, this party would fall apart. Despite Roosevelt's tenacity, he would end up splitting the Republican vote with Taft and allowing Woodrow Wilson to become president. Roosevelt would end up getting 27.3% of the vote, the best third-party performance ever. What we can learn from this. The Bull Moose Party in some ways is the most popular third party ever, but the party itself quickly disappeared when Roosevelt didn't run again. So what a third party today could learn from the Bull Moose Party is that it's very important to have a well-known and well-liked figure at the forefront of your party. Roosevelt is an extreme example of this, being a former president. But you cannot let this well-known figure be your entire party, or your party will only last as long as this person does. Ross Perot. Ross Perot is an American billionaire who made his money in computer software. Perot himself served in the United States Navy. Perot, being a high-profile billionaire, had been influential in politics for years, mostly advocating for POWs, or prisoners of war. The number of POWs had grown increasingly large after the Vietnam War. Perot brought attention to the hundreds of American servicemen still left in Vietnam. Perot became increasingly active in politics in the presidency of George H.W. Bush, opposing the Gulf War and railing against NAFTA. In 1992, Perot announced his intention to run for president in the upcoming election. The 1992 election would feature future President Bill Clinton running against current incumbent George H.W. Bush, who just a few months prior was one of the most popular presidents ever in American history, after the American swift victory in the Gulf War, in which American troops defeated a million-strong Iraqi army that had just defeated Iran in the Iran-Iraq War 2 years prior. After this win by the Americans, H.W.'s popularity rose to 88%, the highest ever for a sitting president. But a downturn in the economy and H.W. having to raise taxes to keep the budget balanced had cost H.W.'s popularity. Also running was Bill Clinton, a candidate whom scandals seemed to just keep following. One scandal being that he cheated on his wife, but the youthful charm he had won over many voters. Going into summer, Ross Perot was polling ahead of the two other candidates. In July, Perot mysteriously dropped out, giving no reason why. Later, he claimed that Bush was threatening to ruin his daughter's wedding, which seems odd because Perot could practically afford any security he wanted for his daughter's wedding, and if Perot had actually been receiving threats from the Bush campaign, he certainly would have came to the press about it. This would have ended Bush's campaign. So this story is clearly not true. Perot is known to be eccentric, so perhaps this factored in, but whatever the reason is, Perot dropped out while he held a lead. But come October, Perot said he was back in the race. This drop killed any momentum he had, and after election night he found himself in the third place, receiving 18.9% of the vote, a staggering amount, and the best third-party finish since 1912. In researching this video, I extensively tried to figure out why Perot dropped out, and a common consensus was that he only ran because he wanted to split Bush's vote, that he had actually no interest in being president. I'm skeptical of this reason because, again, Perot would run in 4 more years against Bill Clinton. Perot would run again in 1996. This time he would create the Reform Party to help him. This time he did much worse, only receiving 8.4% of the vote. Someone who also tried to run under the Reform Party was actually President Donald Trump. Him and Perot actually have a lot in common. Both were billionaires who never held public office before. Trump focused his campaign on the issues of fair trade and eliminating the national debt and installing universal health care, which is hilariously funny looking back on it now. And looking back on it now, we can see where Donald Trump got the populism that he now has in his platform. Perot was America's first populist. He pulled well enough in the Midwest, and his candidacy paved the way for Donald Trump. It was through using elements of populism that Donald Trump won so many swing states in the Rust Belt. Blue-collar workers, some of who lost their job because of NAFTA, secured states like Michigan. Something both Donald Trump and Perot campaigned against was NAFTA. For better or worse, Donald Trump is part of Perot's legacy. Looking back on Perot's legacy and what may have been is important. He may have seemed like he was ahead of the times, but it's important to remember that if elected, he would have faced gridlock in both the House and Senate from Democrats and Republicans who wouldn't want to work with a third party. What I think a third-party candidate can learn from Ross Perot is that it is easier to get policies done if you run as either a Republican and a Democrat. Something both Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders did. Both of these candidates held third-party ideas, and both were able to get some of these ideas through in the main party platform because of them associating with the main two parties. And in my opinion, that's how third parties can win. They must associate themselves with these two major parties, and in turn the two major parties will have to accept their ideas because they are popular, much like the Democratic Party had to accept Bernie Sanders' ideas. This is the future of third parties and how third parties can be viable in our two-party system. And in the future, we will see more candidates with third-party sympathies, like Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump. This has been my presentation on third parties and their place in the future of American politics. I hope you did enjoy it. Here are my sources, my JSTOR sources, and my image sources. Thank you.